So there are whole books written about assessment. This is probably the most famous. It's not flimsy. There's loads in it. And I'm going to try and reduce assessment to basically just two things, knowing that this is a simplification, but it's one I think that will help you. So number one, you need to assess kids on enough knowledge that you've taught them so that you've got a fair guess from that assessment as to what they know and don't know, and as to what they can do and can't do. Well, let me give you a mainstream setting. Typically, schools will teach kids using a knowledge organiser. And when you look at the knowledge organiser, say for a 6-week unit, you'll find that it might have 150 separate facts on it. And yet the assessment that the students do might only have 20 one-mark questions on it. And you then say to the teacher, well, if you've taught them 150 facts, how many would you have to test to say, I'm pretty confident that the score they got in that would be the same score, percentage-wise, that they would have got if I managed to test all 150. And I've never had a teacher say anything less than 50% of that, so they'd have to ask 75 questions. Well, in a special school context, you probably aren't teaching quite as many facts, which will be a godsend because your assessment doesn't have to be as big. But let's say you've taught them 50 things over those 6 weeks. You have to test as many of them as you can. And I'm going to suggest you could do all 50. Then we move on to the application task. Now, often what happens in a secondary school is they don't think, what will show me how good that student is at whatever makes somebody good at my subject? Instead, they say, how will the GCSE test this? And then how can I use that kind of question now in year 7 or year 8 or year 9? This is nearly always a mistake. And so I'll illustrate it using English. In English literature, students are given an extract and then they are told to write about the extract, about a character, say, and then add in some more about the character from elsewhere in the text. The reason for that is that students who know nothing about the text and haven't done any revision will still be able to answer part of the question because there's an extract in front of them and they can write about that. Nuts! The other reason it's nuts is the prime skill of somebody studying English literature is to be able to develop an argument, putting forward a point of view. It's impossible almost, not quite, but almost impossible to put forward a logical argument if you don't move through the text in a chronological order. Well, having an extract to write about that doesn't start at the very beginning of the text immediately destroys your chronological order, and it immediately destroys any building of a logical argument. And so these questions are a disaster for students at GCSE. They don't make any sense and they teach the wrong skills. They don't teach students how to write coherent essays. So if I'm looking at introducing essay writing, I'm going to do it logically from year 7. We're going to plan an argument together, the number of points that students need to make and the sequence that they need to put them in. That's going to be part of my assessment. If I just go from the GCSE, which most English teams do, they'll just reproduce that. They'll just give them an extract from whatever text they're studying in year 7 and tell them to write about the character in that extract and elsewhere in the text. Nonsense. If the GCSE didn't exist, and this is the thought experiment that will always help you, if the GCSE didn't exist, what task would you get the kids to do? This is a brilliant way of uncovering high value tasks. So if I come back to English again, I'd want the kids to learn to essay write. I'd want them to write stories. I'd want them to write poems. Well, schools never give poetry writing as an assessment because it's not done at the GCSE. They rarely give story writing as an assessment because most of them encourage students to answer a description question. For those of you who don't know, students have to write 300 to 500 word descriptions, something which real writers in real books would never do because it ruins the book. So it's a nonsense skill that's just there for the exam, whereas if the GCSE doesn't exist, we would not create that assessment. We would include description as part of the opening chapter to a book or as part of a story. So this is my metaphor, if you like, my allegory for how you need to think about assessment. Pick tasks that genuinely reflect what you would value in your subject if they were no GCSE, and then give those tasks as an assessment to the students. Then you have to combine the two, that application task with the knowledge test, and work out what it is that your students can and can't do. The brilliant thing about the knowledge test and the application test is that you can repeat them at later times to see what's going into long-term memory and to measure improvement. Or you'll find that the scores go down, in which case your curriculum needs to change because they're not revisiting this content at the right gaps. So those are, I said there were only going to be 2 principles, but there are now 3 principles. Test as much of the knowledge as you can. Test the application of knowledge in ways that actually produce mastery, whatever that level is in your context, rather than just repeating the GCSE. And then repeat the assessments over time to measure the impact of your curriculum.